The first thing I heard was glass shattering across the ballroom floor. For a second, every conversation stopped, heads turned. A woman near the buffet gasped. And standing 20 feet away from me, frozen beside a table covered with miniature cheesecakes and shrimp cocktail, was Melissa Grant, my former best friend. The woman who ran off with my fiancé the night before our wedding. The crystal wine glass had slipped right out of her hand. Red wine spread across the carpet. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the strangest moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because 7 years earlier, I would have given anything to see Melissa lose her perfect composure in public. Back then, I was the one dropping things. Back then, I was the one shaking. Back then, I was the woman whose life had exploded overnight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up standing in a Holiday Inn ballroom in Springfield, Missouri, watching my former best friend stare at me like she'd just seen a ghost. Because 7 years earlier, I thought my life was over. And honestly, for a while, it felt like it was. In September of 2018, I was 40 years old and finally getting married. Not for the first time. Not after some whirlwind romance. This was supposed to be the sensible marriage, the grown-up marriage. The kind that happens when you've made enough mistakes to appreciate stability. Ryan Mercer and I had been together for almost 4 years. He managed sales at a Ford dealership on the north side of Springfield. Everybody liked Ryan. He remembered names. He shook hands like he meant it. He could make strangers feel like old friends. Looking back, I realized that was part of the problem. Men like Ryan know exactly what people want to hear, and they're usually very good at saying it. At the time, though, I thought I'd found my person. The church was booked. The reception hall was paid for. My wedding dress hung in the guest bedroom closet. My Aunt Linda had already driven down from Wichita. My cousin Denise flew in from Dallas. Everything was ready. Or so I thought. The day before the wedding, Melissa came over to help me organize place cards. Melissa and I had been friends since middle school. We'd survived bad haircuts, bad boyfriends, and bad decisions together. At least that's what I believed. We sat at my dining room table eating takeout from Chinese kitchen while sorting names into alphabetical order. Ryan stopped by after work. He kissed my forehead, made some joke about how expensive weddings were, then he left. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed wrong. If somebody had told me that would be the last normal moment of my old life, I would have laughed. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Wedding day. I remember making coffee and standing by the kitchen window. I remember feeling nervous, excited, grateful, the kind of emotions people are supposed to feel on their wedding day. By 8:00, Ryan still hadn't answered any texts. By 9:00, he wasn't answering calls. By 10:00, something inside me started to tighten. The ceremony was scheduled for 2:00. Guests were already arriving. Family members were getting dressed. The florist was setting up, and nobody knew where my fiancé was. At 11:37, my phone buzzed. A text message. Just one sentence. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." That was it. No explanation, no phone call, no conversation. 4 years together, one sentence. At first, I thought he was panicking. People get cold feet. It happens. Then my cousin Denise walked into the kitchen holding her phone. Her face had gone completely pale. She showed me a Facebook photo. Ryan and Melissa together at a gas station outside town. Someone had posted it 30 minutes earlier. I don't remember much after that. Not in order, anyway. Trauma doesn't organize memories neatly. It scatters them. I remember dropping my phone. I remember my aunt crying. I remember somebody asking if they should call the church. I remember sitting on the floor. Then I remember having to stand back up because there were practical things to do. That's the cruel part nobody talks about. Even when your heart breaks, paperwork still exists. Phone calls still need to be made. Deposits are still non-refundable. I spent the next 6 hours calling guests over and over, repeating the same humiliating explanation. The wedding wasn't postponed. Ryan wasn't sick. Everything was not okay. My favorite call was with Aunt Linda. And by favorite, I mean least terrible. She listened quietly. Then she said, "Honey, if I drove 4 hours for nothing, at least let me take you to dinner." I cried harder after that. The wedding cake situation was almost funny. Almost, the bakery refused to refund us. The owner actually said, "Well, my daughter gets free cake now, so I guess somebody wins." I stared at her. Then, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because if I hadn't laughed, I probably would have screamed. For years afterward, whenever somebody mentioned buttercream frosting, I got irritated. It's amazing what your brain decides to associate with emotional devastation. The months that followed weren't dramatic. They were worse. They were ordinary. I went to therapy every Thursday afternoon. Same office, same brown couch, same box of tissues. I sold my house because I couldn't afford it alone. I downsized to a small apartment. I stopped going to places where I might run into Ryan or Melissa. I learned which grocery stores they used, which restaurants they liked, which church they attended. Springfield isn't a huge city. Avoiding people takes effort, but I managed. Slowly, life moved forward. Not because I wanted it to, because life always does. I started an event planning business, small weddings, retirement parties, corporate lunches, nothing glamorous, just enough work to keep the lights on, then enough to hire help, then enough to build something stable. Not spectacular, just honest. And after what I'd been through, honest felt pretty good. 7 years passed. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail. Springfield High School Class of 1995 Reunion. 30 years. Holiday Inn Conference Center. September 2025. I almost threw it away. Actually, I did throw it away. Then, I dug it out of the trash later that night because a question kept bothering me. What if I was still hiding? What if 7 years later, Ryan and Melissa were still controlling where I felt comfortable showing up? That thought irritated me more than the reunion itself, so I bought a ticket. And for weeks afterward, I regretted it. The night of the reunion, I sat in my car outside the hotel parking lot for almost 15 minutes. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel. I remember looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror, then saying out loud, "Come on, Dana. You're not 40 anymore. You're not that woman." Eventually, I got out of the car, walked toward the entrance, and stepped inside. I had no idea that before the night was over, the entire room would learn the truth about Ryan Mercer. Or that Melissa Grant would end up standing in spilled wine, staring at me in shock, because fate had one more surprise waiting behind those ballroom doors. The Holiday Inn ballroom smelled exactly the way I remembered every reunion, retirement banquet, and church fundraiser smelling. Coffee, old carpet, a little too much perfume, a little too much air freshener trying to hide the old carpet. I stood just inside the entrance, clutching a plastic name tag that said Donna Whitaker, as if anybody there needed help identifying me. Most of us had known each other since we were 14. A few people waved when they saw me. A couple of old classmates walked over. There were hugs, questions about work, questions about parents, questions about whether I still lived in Springfield. The usual reunion conversations. Safe conversations. Conversations that avoided everything important. I was grateful for that, at least at first. Well, look at you. I turned and saw Cheryl Benson approaching. Back in high school, Cheryl had been on the yearbook staff and knew everybody's business before anybody else did. Some things never change. She hugged me, pulled back, and looked me over. You look good, Dana. So do you. You're a terrible liar. I laughed. I learned from the best. That earned me a grin. For the first 20 minutes, things weren't terrible. Awkward, sure, but survivable. I chatted with former classmates, looked at old photographs displayed on a table near the stage, and winced at my senior portrait. Nobody should have been allowed that much hairspray. At one point, somebody started telling a story about our chemistry teacher accidentally setting off a fire alarm in 1994, and people laughed. For a moment, I relaxed. Maybe I'd worried for nothing. Maybe Ryan and Melissa weren't even coming. Then the ballroom doors opened, and there they were. Somehow, after 7 years, I recognized them instantly. Ryan Mercer, Melissa Grant, walking side by side, looking exactly like the kind of couple that posted smiling vacation photos while secretly hating each other. Not that I knew whether they hated each other at the time, that was just wishful thinking. Melissa was wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first car. Ryan had on an expensive sports jacket. Both of them looked polished and prepared, like they'd shown up expecting an audience. A few people greeted them immediately. Ryan shook hands. Melissa kissed cheeks. They moved through the room with the confidence of people who assumed they belonged at the center of attention. I looked away. Unfortunately, Melissa spotted me. Of course she did. Some people can sense unfinished business from 50 yards away. Her smile froze for half a second, then returned brighter than before. That told me everything I needed to know. She was nervous. Good, I wasn't the only one. Dana, I heard Ryan's voice before I saw him. Funny how some voices can drag you backward through time. I turned. He stood there smiling the exact same smile that used to make me feel safe. Now it just made me tired. Ryan, been a while. 7 years. He nodded. Guess so. An uncomfortable silence followed. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I just wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Melissa appeared beside him. Her perfume arrived a full second before she did. Dana, Melissa, another silence. This one even worse. Then Melissa smiled. Oh my goodness, it's been forever. As if she'd run into me at Target instead of helping destroy my wedding. I almost admired the commitment. The conversation should have ended there. It didn't. Ryan stayed. Melissa stayed. And before long, several other classmates joined the group. That's how it happens at reunions. People drift together. Nobody realizes they're walking into a disaster. For a few minutes, everything remained civil. Then Melissa started talking. Actually, talking isn't the right word. Performing is more accurate. She talked about Cabo. She talked about Scottsdale. She talked about remodeling their lake house. She talked about a luxury cruise she'd taken the previous summer. Every story somehow circled back to money, status, or how wonderful her life supposedly was. At one point, she sighed dramatically. "We've traveled so much lately. I nearly choked on my iced tea." That sentence alone probably cost more than my electric bill. A woman named Karen tried to redirect the conversation. "What about you, Dana? How's work?" "I appreciated the effort. My business is doing well." "What kind of business?" "I own an event planning company." Karen smiled. "That's wonderful. It keeps me busy." Before I could say anything else, Ryan jumped in. "Small business ownership is tough these days." The tone wasn't openly insulting, which somehow made it worse. It sounded like concern the fake kind. The kind people use when they're really measuring themselves against you. I smiled politely. "It has its moments." Ryan nodded. "Well, I'm glad you're doing okay." Something about the way he emphasized okay irritated me. Like he was handing out participation trophies, like survival was the best I could have hoped for. The worst part was that nobody else seemed to notice. At least not yet. Because people like Ryan are skilled. They know exactly how far they can push before looking cruel. I excused myself and headed toward the refreshment table. My hands felt shaky. I hated that. I hated that after 7 years he could still affect me. "Breathe, Dana." I said it quietly, just loud enough for myself. Breathe, the same thing I'd told myself in therapy. The same thing I'd told myself walking into the hotel. The same thing I'd been telling myself for years. When I turned around, Ryan was standing there again. This time alone. I immediately knew something bad was coming. You know how animals sense storms? That's how it felt. He picked up a drink, looked around the room, then back at me. "You know," he said casually, "I always wondered how things would have turned out." I didn't answer. I mean, obviously everything worked out for the best. There it was. The storm. I guess that's one way to look at it. He laughed. Actually laughed. Then leaned slightly closer, not enough for a private conversation, just enough so nearby people could hear. "Honestly, Dana, I already knew I wasn't going to like the next sentence. Leaving you was the best decision I ever made." Silence. Complete silence. The kind that spreads through a group before anybody realizes it's happening. Someone stopped chewing. Someone else looked down at their shoes. A woman near us muttered, "Oh wow," nobody laughed. Nobody agreed. But nobody challenged him either. And somehow that hurt almost as much. Ryan smiled, satisfied, like he'd finally said something he'd been rehearsing for years. For a second, I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't think. I was back in my kitchen. Back on my wedding day. Back staring at that text message. Back wondering why I wasn't enough. 7 years of rebuilding. 7 years of therapy. 7 years of moving forward. And somehow one sentence still knew exactly where the scar was. I hated that more than I hated him. Ryan seemed pleased with himself. Melissa was watching from nearby, not stopping him, not embarrassed, just watching. And that told me everything. Some people don't grow. They simply get older. I forced myself to smile. A small one. Nothing dramatic. Then I said, "Well, I'm glad one of us got what they wanted." Ryan blinked. Maybe he expected anger. Maybe tears. Maybe a scene. Instead, I picked up my drink, turned away, and walked toward the opposite side of the room. My heart was pounding. My hands were cold. For a moment, I seriously considered leaving. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe I never should have come. Maybe the ballroom doors opened. A few people glanced toward the entrance, then a few more, then nearly everyone. Suddenly, the entire room was staring at the same thing. A man had just walked inside. Beside him was a little boy, and within seconds, both of them were headed straight toward me. The first person I recognized was Ethan Brooks. Not because he was famous. Springfield isn't the kind of place where famous people casually wander into hotel ballrooms, but Ethan had become one of those local success stories everybody seemed to know, the kind people talked about with equal parts admiration and curiosity. Back in high school, Ethan had been quiet. Painfully quiet. He sat near the back of classrooms, got good grades, and never caused trouble. If you'd asked me in 1995 which guy from our class would eventually become one of the most successful businessmen in Southwest Missouri, I probably wouldn't have guessed Ethan. Then again, life rarely asks our opinion before surprising us. He looked older now. Of course, we all did. A little gray at the temples, a little less hair than before, but he carried himself differently than most people in the room. Not arrogant, not flashy, comfortable, like a man who no longer needed anybody's approval. Walking beside him was Noah, 4 years old, with brown hair, blue sneakers, and a tiny Springfield Cardinals baseball cap, sitting crooked on his head. The second Noah spotted me, his entire face lit up, and before I could react, he broke free from Ethan's hand. Dana. The room watched. Noah ran straight toward me. I barely had time to kneel before he launched himself into my arms. Then came the moment nobody in that ballroom was prepared for, including me. Mama. The word echoed louder than it should have. Maybe because everything else had gone silent. Maybe because dozens of people had stopped talking at exactly the same moment. Noah wrapped his little arms around my neck. Mama, we found you. A few gasps floated through the room. I heard somebody whisper, "Did he just say Mama?" Then came the sound that started the entire evening. A wine glass slipping from someone's hand, crashing against the floor. I looked up. Melissa stood frozen beside a cocktail table, red wine spreading across the carpet, her mouth slightly open. For the first time all night, she looked genuinely shocked. Not annoyed, not smug, not superior. Shocked, and standing beside her, Ryan looked almost as confused. Almost, the confusion didn't last long. It quickly became something else, something closer to worry. I hugged Noah tightly. "Hey, buddy, you came!" He nodded enthusiastically. "You said there'd be cake." I laughed. "Of course, that's what you remember." Ethan finally reached us. "Sorry about that." "No, you're not." He smiled. "No, not really." That earned a few chuckles from nearby classmates. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Not gone, just different. For a few seconds, nobody seemed sure what to do. Then people started approaching. Questions appeared immediately, the way they always do in small towns, especially when somebody's carefully constructed assumptions suddenly fall apart. Dana Karen stepped closer. "Who's this handsome little guy?" Before I could answer, Noah proudly announced, "I'm Noah," as if everybody should already know that. Karen laughed. "Nice to meet you, Noah." Then she looked at Ethan and suddenly recognition spread. "Oh my goodness, Ethan Brooks." He smiled politely. "Guilty." That was all it took. Within moments, half the room seemed aware of who had arrived. Meanwhile, Ryan and Melissa continued watching from across the room. Neither one had moved. Neither one looked comfortable. "Good." Ethan glanced around. "I think we interrupted something." "Not really." "You sure?" I looked toward Ryan, then back at Ethan. Pretty sure. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not because he knew exactly what had happened, because he knew enough. Over the last 2 years, he'd heard pieces of the story. Not every detail, not every painful memory, just enough to understand why certain names still made my stomach tighten. The truth was, Ethan hadn't rescued me. And that mattered because too many stories make women over 40 seem like they're waiting for some man to save them. That wasn't my story. By the time Ethan entered my life, I'd already rebuilt mine. What he brought wasn't rescue. It was companionship, trust, patience, things I'd stopped expecting. I first met him 3 years earlier. My event planning business had landed a contract for a regional business conference in Branson. I was exhausted, understaffed, and convinced the whole event was about to collapse. Ethan was one of the keynote speakers. At the time, I barely knew who he was. I remember accidentally spilling coffee on a stack of presentation materials. Not exactly a glamorous first impression. Instead of getting annoyed, Ethan helped me clean it up. Then, he spent 20 minutes helping move tables. Most executives would have disappeared. He stayed. That was my first clue. The second clue came months later. A winter storm knocked out power across part of Springfield. My apartment building lost heat. I mentioned it during a phone call. The next morning, Ethan showed up with 2 space heaters and enough groceries to survive a snowstorm. No grand speech, no flirting, no expectation, just kindness. The older I get, the more impressive kindness becomes. Then came Noah. His mother had died in a car accident about 2 years before. I never asked for details. Ethan never volunteered many. Grief has its own privacy. I respected that. Over time, though, Noah became part of my life. Movie nights, school pickups, pancake breakfasts, zoo trips, little moments, the kind that quietly become important before you realize they're happening. One evening, about a year earlier, Noah called me Mama for the first time. I immediately corrected him. "Honey, I'm not your mama." He looked at me seriously, the way only children can. "I know." "Then why'd you call me that?" "Because you're my other mama." Then he went back to eating chicken nuggets as if he'd solved the mystery. Kids do that. They drop life-changing statements into conversations and then move on. The nickname stayed, not because anyone planned it, not because Ethan encouraged it, because Noah wanted it. And after a while, neither of us had the heart to stop him. Now that same little boy sat happily beside me in a Holiday Inn ballroom, eating cake and unknowingly causing emotional chaos. I glanced across the room. Melissa was still watching. Ryan, too. But something had changed. The confidence was gone. The performance was cracking. For the first time that evening, they weren't controlling the story. "Can I have another cookie?" Noah asked. "You already had 2. I had 1.5. You negotiated that pretty fast." He grinned. I looked at Ethan. "You taught him that?" "Absolutely not. You're both terrible liars." Nearby, several classmates laughed. The mood kept shifting. People were asking questions now. Real questions. Questions Ryan and Melissa clearly didn't enjoy hearing. How long had Dana known Ethan? Was Noah Ethan's son? Were Dana and Ethan together? When had all this happened? And most importantly, how had nobody known? I wasn't trying to impress anyone. That was the funny part. I hadn't come to the reunion with a plan, no revenge, no dramatic reveal, no desire to make anyone jealous. I'd shown up alone, prepared to survive one awkward evening. Instead, life had delivered something much better. The truth. And the truth was surprisingly powerful, Because while Ryan and Melissa had spent 7 years assuming they knew exactly how my story ended, they hadn't been paying attention. Across the room, I watched Cheryl Benson approach Ryan. She leaned close, said something quietly. Ryan's expression changed immediately. Then Cheryl looked in my direction and smiled. That's when I realized something was about to happen. Something neither Ryan nor Melissa had seen coming. If you've ever attended a small-town reunion, you know something important. People don't really stop paying attention. They just pretend to. Conversations continue. Drinks get poured. Music plays. But everybody is quietly watching everybody else, especially when something interesting starts happening. And at that moment, the most interesting thing in the room wasn't the dessert table or the photo display. It was Ryan Mercer. Because for the first time all evening, he looked uncomfortable, not embarrassed, not irritated, uneasy. The kind of uneasy that happens when a person realizes the room is no longer moving in the direction they expected. I saw Cheryl Benson approach him near the bar. She said something quietly, Ryan answered. Then Cheryl said something else. This time, his smile disappeared. A few nearby classmates noticed. Then a few more. Human beings are funny that way. Curiosity spreads faster than gossip. And in Springfield, that's saying something. I was helping Noah decide between another cookie and a brownie when Cheryl walked over. She looked at me, then at Ethan, then back at me. You okay? I smiled. Better than I expected. She nodded. Good. There was something deliberate in her voice, like she'd made a decision. The kind of decision that takes years, maybe even 7 years. You know, Cheryl said, I've never told anybody this. I immediately knew we weren't talking about cookies anymore. Ethan sensed it, too. He quietly guided Noah toward a nearby table where some other grandchildren of classmates were coloring. Not far away, close enough to keep an eye on him. Far enough to give adults room to talk. Cheryl folded her arms. I worked at Grant Motors for almost 3 years. I remembered. Melissa's father owned several dealerships around Southwest Missouri. Everybody knew that. What about it? She hesitated. I knew Ryan before you and Melissa split. Something tightened inside my chest. Not pain. Not exactly. More like anticipation. The strange feeling that comes when an old mystery finally starts revealing itself. For years, I'd imagined what happened behind my back, not obsessively, just enough. Questions don't disappear simply because time passes. They settle into quiet corners of your mind. Then wait. Cheryl looked uncomfortable, not because she enjoyed gossip, because she didn't. That's what made people trust her. I didn't say anything back then because, honestly, she sighed. I didn't think you'd want to hear it. I nodded. Fair enough. She wasn't wrong. 7 years earlier, I probably couldn't have handled it. What exactly are you saying? Cheryl glanced across the room. Ryan was pretending not to watch us. Nobody was buying it. Ryan and Melissa didn't suddenly fall in love. The words landed softly. But they landed. I figured that. No, Cheryl shook her head. You don't understand. Then she lowered her voice. They'd been seeing each other for months. For a second, I simply stared at her. Months, not weeks. Months. I thought back to all those wedding appointments, all those evenings, all those weekends. Every memory suddenly looked different. You sure? Cheryl laughed once, not because anything was funny. Unfortunately, then she told me something I wasn't expecting. It wasn't really about love. I blinked. What? She nodded toward Ryan. At least not for him. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Not literally. People were still talking. The music was still playing, but my attention narrowed. Everything else faded. Ryan talked about the dealerships constantly. Cheryl continued. Expansion plans, ownership opportunities, investment possibilities. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I already knew where this was heading. He saw Melissa as a shortcut. There it was. The truth. Simple, ugly, ordinary, the worst betrayals usually are. Not some grand romance. Not destiny. Not true love, opportunity, money, access, a faster path. I thought I'd feel devastated hearing that. Instead, I felt strangely calm because suddenly things made sense. Ryan hadn't left because he found someone better. He left because he found something easier. A familiar voice interrupted. That's not what happened, Ryan, of course. He'd finally decided to join the conversation. Several nearby classmates turned. The circle around us grew slightly larger. Nobody announced it. Nobody planned it. People simply drifted closer, the way people always do when they sense honesty and conflict approaching each other. Ryan forced a smile. Come on, Cheryl. She looked unimpressed. What? You really want to do this? His voice sharpened. That alone told me everything. Truth rarely makes people angry. Exposure does. Before Cheryl could answer, another voice spoke. Actually, I'd like to hear the rest, Karen. Then another classmate nodded. So would I. Then another. And another. Nobody sounded hostile. Just interested, which somehow made things worse for Ryan. Melissa finally approached. Her confidence had faded considerably. Can we not turn this into a spectacle? Nobody answered. The silence was answer enough. Then Ethan stepped forward. Not dramatically, not like some movie hero, just a man joining a conversation. Ryan looked relieved to have a new target. Ethan, Ryan, they shook hands briefly. The most uncomfortable handshake I'd ever seen. Ryan attempted a smile. I hear business is going well. It is. Must be nice. It is. Ryan waited, apparently expecting more. Ethan didn't give him any. Finally, Ryan said, well, not everybody gets lucky. The comment hung in the air, subtle, petty, transparent. Ethan studied him for a moment, then tilted his head slightly. You know, Ryan immediately regretted whatever was coming next. You could see it. Weren't you the salesman who tried to sell me that F-150 with the bad transmission? Silence, then laughter. Real laughter. The uncontrollable kind. Karen nearly spit out her drink. Someone behind me said, "Oh no." Another person laughed even harder. Ryan's face turned red. I don't remember that. Ethan nodded. I do. The room erupted again. It wasn't cruel. That's the important part. Nobody was attacking Ryan. They were simply seeing him clearly. Maybe for the first time. And once that happens, the performance ends. Ryan looked around, searching for support, finding none. That's when I finally spoke. Not because I'd planned some speech, not because I'd rehearsed revenge in front of a mirror, because after 7 years, I suddenly knew exactly what needed to be said. I looked directly at him. Ryan, he met my eyes. For once, neither of us looked away. For 7 years, I thought you left because I wasn't enough. The room became completely still. I continued. Tonight, I finally understand something. I paused. Not for effect, for clarity. You didn't choose something better. I saw Melissa flinch. You chose something easier. Silence, no shouting, no insults, no dramatic music, just silence. The kind that arrives when everyone recognizes the truth at the exact same moment. Then I added one final thing. The thing I never expected to say. I don't hate either of you anymore. Ryan blinked. Melissa looked stunned. I smiled. Small, genuine, free, I just feel sorry for you. Nobody spoke because there was nothing left to say. For 7 years, I'd imagined revenge as something loud, something explosive, something that would make me feel victorious. Instead, it felt like setting down a heavy box I'd been carrying for too long. Across the room, Noah waved a brownie at me, completely unaware that decades of emotional baggage had just collapsed behind him. I laughed, and for the first time that night, it felt effortless. A few minutes later, Melissa quietly disappeared toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. She looked shaken, lost even, and something told me the story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes the most honest conversation happens after the audience leaves. I found Melissa standing alone on the second-floor balcony overlooking the hotel parking lot. The reunion was still going strong inside. Music drifted through the open doors. People laughed. Glasses clinked. Someone was telling an overly detailed story about high school football. The normal sounds of a reunion, but out here it was quiet. The September air carried just enough coolness to remind you summer was ending. Melissa leaned against the railing, her arms crossed, her shoulders tense. For a moment, I considered turning around. Walking away would have been easier. For years, I'd imagined conversations with Melissa. In most of those imaginary versions, I said something devastating, something clever, something that left her speechless. Funny thing about real life, when the moment finally arrives, most of those speeches disappear. What's left is usually simpler and more honest. Melissa noticed me. Neither of us spoke immediately. We stood there listening to distant traffic from Interstate 44, watching headlights move through the darkness. Two women who had once shared everything, now separated by 7 years of silence. Finally, Melissa sighed. "You looked happy in there." I wasn't expecting that. Of all the possible opening lines, that one hadn't made the list. "I am." She nodded slowly. "I can see that." The words sounded sincere, which somehow made them sadder. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then Melissa laughed softly. Not a happy laugh. The kind people make when they're exhausted. "You know what the worst part is?" I waited. "Everybody thinks I won." I looked at her. The expensive dress, the jewelry, the carefully styled hair, the image she'd spent years building. From a distance, it probably did look like winning. Melissa stared into the parking lot. I spent 7 years convincing people my life was perfect. There was no self-pity in her voice, just fatigue. I got really good at it. I believed her. I'd seen the performance myself, vacation photos, social media posts, stories about resorts and cruises, every detail polished, every detail intentional. Then she surprised me. "You want to know the truth?" I didn't answer. She took that as permission. The first year was exciting. A bitter smile appeared, maybe even the second. Then it vanished. But after a while, she shook her head. "I started thinking about you." That caught me off guard. "Why?" Melissa laughed again, "Because every time Ryan disappointed me, I remembered what he did to you." The words hung between us. Heavy, uncomfortable true, she continued. Every argument, every lie, every time he came home late, her eyes stayed fixed on the parking lot. I'd ask myself the same question. She swallowed hard. "If he could leave you the night before your wedding," a pause. "What makes me think he won't leave me someday?" There it was. Not bankruptcy, not scandal, not public humiliation. Fear, years of fear. The kind that quietly follows a person everywhere. Into their marriage, into their vacations, into their bed at night. I thought I'd enjoy hearing that. For years, I'd imagined Melissa regretting what she'd done. But standing there listening to her describe a life built on uncertainty, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and oddly sad. Melissa wiped at one eye. Quickly, as if embarrassed. We don't even like each other half the time anymore. I said nothing. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was confessing. There was a difference. He still chases shortcuts. A humorless smile crossed her face. Just different ones. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. A car pulled into the parking lot below. Its headlights swept across the building, then disappeared. Melissa looked at me. Really? Looked at me. For the first time in years, no competition, no performance, no masks. I was jealous of you. The admission seemed to surprise even her. I always have been. I blinked. What? She nodded. You were the person everybody trusted. That wasn't where I thought this conversation was heading. You were kind. You had friends. You made people feel comfortable. She laughed quietly. I spent years trying to be impressive. Another pause. You spent years trying to be decent. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Melissa shook her head. I thought taking Ryan meant I won. The sentence sounded ridiculous now. Even she seemed aware of it. Turns out people aren't trophies. The irony hit both of us at the same time because it was exactly the kind of thing a woman learns after 50. Not after 25, not after 35, after enough years to see how choices actually play out. Finally, Melissa straightened. The vulnerability disappeared. Not completely, but enough. I should probably get back inside. Probably, she nodded, then stopped. Dana. Yeah. I'm sorry. Not the kind of apology that fixes anything. Not the kind that erases 7 years. Just an honest one. Late, incomplete, real. I looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Not because everything was forgiven. Because carrying anger had become exhausting. Take care of yourself, Melissa, she smiled sadly. You too. Then she walked away, and that was the last private conversation we ever had. 6 months later, spring arrived in Missouri. The kind of spring where everybody suddenly remembers why they tolerate winter. The trees turned green. Little League Baseball started again. And on a Saturday afternoon in April, I found myself sitting on aluminum bleachers at a community park on the east side of Springfield. Noah was playing second base, or at least attempting to. Mostly he seemed interested in chasing butterflies. Watch the ball, buddy, I called. Noah waved, completely ignoring the advice. Beside me, Ethan laughed. Future Hall of Famer? Definitely, maybe not in baseball. Probably not. We sat there sharing hot dogs and lemonade. Nothing glamorous, nothing extraordinary. Just life. Real life. The kind I used to think was boring. Now it felt precious. A few months earlier, Ethan and I had quietly started talking about marriage. Not a huge wedding. Neither of us wanted that. One wedding disaster in a lifetime was enough for me. Maybe a small ceremony. Close family, close friends, nothing fancy, just honest. At one point, Ethan reached over and took my hand. No grand gesture, no dramatic declaration, just a simple squeeze. The kind that says, I'm here. 7 years earlier, I would have measured success differently. Money, status, appearances, the things Ryan and Melissa spent years chasing. Now, success looked like this. A sunny afternoon, a child laughing on a baseball field, a man I trusted. Peace. The people who betrayed me once believed they had the power to define my future. For a long time, I believed it too. I thought my story ended the day Ryan walked away. I thought being abandoned was the most important thing that ever happened to me. I was wrong. It wasn't the ending. It was simply a chapter. A painful one, but still just a chapter. If you've ever had to rebuild after betrayal, heartbreak, or disappointment, I hope you remember something. The people who hurt you don't get to write the rest of your story. Only you do. And sometimes the happiest chapters are the ones you never saw coming. And just like that, life moved on. Not with revenge, not with loud victories, but with quiet peace. Sitting there on those bleachers, watching Noah laugh and stumble through a game he didn't even take seriously, I finally understood something important. The people who once broke your heart don't stay the center of your story forever. They only stay as long as you keep giving them that space. Because in the end, healing doesn't look like winning against them. It looks like waking up one day and realizing you don't think about them first anymore. You think about your peace, your people, your present. Ethan gently squeezed my hand again, and this time I didn't look back at the past at all. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, my life wasn't something I survived. It was something I was actually living. And if you're watching this right now feeling like your story ended in the wrong place, trust me, it didn't. The best chapters often begin after the heartbreak. So don't stop here. Because what comes next might be the part where everything finally starts to make sense.